All right. So welcome to the second climate team meeting. I'm Katie Saunders. I'm the one that's been sending multiple emails to you. So thank you all for coming out on a blustery night and reading through all the information we've been sending out. John, do you want to reintroduce yourself? Do you want to reintroduce yourself? Do folks want to do another just quick round of reminders since last time we were online? That'd be great. Yeah, do you want to start right here?
I'm Matt Gill, work out at the Marathon Petroleum Refinery out on March Point. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Mike. Nice. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Marlene Finley. I'm the president of Evergreen Islands.
Hi, Marlene. Thanks for being here.
Is it my turn?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm coming in late. Crystal Stedham, Skagit Transit CEO.
Thank you for being here, Crystal.
Hi, Sandy Finney, Chief Strategy Officer, excuse me, of Skagit County.
Thanks.
I'm Andy Wilkin. I'm the Facilities and Operations Supervisor for the Anacortes School District.
Thanks, Andy.
Warren Tesler, Board of Commissioners, Island Health.
Thanks, Warren. Nice to have you here.
Bill Harris, Fire Chief, City of Anacortes.
Thanks, Chief Harris.
And John Coleman, Director of Planning, Community and Economic Development for the city.
Yeah, totally. The only part is it's going to cover up some slides, so we might have to minimize it, but maybe we can turn it on and off. We're just figuring out for folks online wanting to see faces. We have a few folks that are attending online. Are folks able to take themselves off mute and talk?
I can talk. Can you?
Perfect. We're hearing you. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you for attending. I know you have to just be here until about 6. Is that the case?
Yeah. I have
Okay.
to drop off.
Perfect. And I should have introduced Beth in the beginning, and Marcus is also sitting in. Beth, do you want to reintroduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Beth Miller with Parametrics, and I'm doing a lot of the greenhouse gas mitigation and inventory work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marcus Johnson, Associate Planner at Makers Architecture and Design.
Great. So I am going to minimize your you guys just so we can see the slides. So, but we'll try to turn the faces back on later in the presentation. Oops, and that's going to pop up several times. Oops, and someone just joined, so we'll see who is able to. Okay. Well, we're just getting started. I didn't see who just joined, but you're welcome. We're happy to have you here tonight. So we just did our welcomes. So we're going to start tonight with new business, and we have someone joining in here too. So we'll wrap them into the let you get settled, and then we can do introductions or welcomes. We have a little bit of new business we just want to get out of the way in the beginning so we can focus the rest of the meeting on the discussion that we have tonight. So the first piece of business is upcoming meeting dates. And I know there's been lots of meeting dates floating around in email and a little bit of confusion there. Or apologize if there's confusion of the meetings. We have 2 upcoming meetings. So the first one we'll talk about is the January meeting, which is our next climate team meeting. And it looked like the 14th was the best date for that. So we will be sending out a calendar or an Outlook invite after this meeting to put that on your calendars. But just so you know that that's the date that seemed to emerge in the doodle poll. And that will be a similar meeting just like this of just the climate team. The December meeting that was also sent out via doodle poll is a public meeting focused on marine, shoreline, and waterfront topics. And so we sent out a doodle poll to see, just to make sure we were selecting a date that would work. It was a little bit mixed on the feedback, but it does look like the December 4th date is the one that works for the most people. So we will be scheduling that. If it hasn't gone out today, it'll go out tomorrow. So hoping to see folks. So that is a public meeting focused on those marine waterfront topics. We sent it out to the climate team for your awareness. You are welcome to attend. It's not a requirement. It's not a specific climate team meeting, but if you're particularly interested or the perspective you speak from is particularly interested in those areas, you're very welcome to attend. You're also welcome and encouraged to share that out. So folks that you're connected to that are involved in those topics or would be interested in those topics know about it. And it's an information session. There'll be information online about it, but really an information session to share information analysis if folks didn't know about the open house or didn't have a chance to attend. A little bit of a focused attention on marine and shoreline, knowing that's just a really important topic to folks in Anacortes. And we'll be covering both climate impacts to support the resilience sub-element, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, that's that. I know a couple of folks have joined, or we have a couple of folks at the table that have joined. Do you want to just say hi?
Okay, I probably don't need this, but I'm Carolyn Moulton, Anacortes City Council, apologizing for being late, and I'm glad to be here. Glad so many people could come in person.
What?
Hello, John Lunsford, Parks and Recreation Director. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, John, for being here. Thanks, Carolyn. The other thing I wanted to ask about, and this pertains back to our January 14th meeting, is that meeting will be focused, it'll be similar, I think, in structure to tonight, but focus more on resilience topics. Tonight, we're really focusing on the greenhouse gas inventory. And I wanted to get a poll from folks in the room of their, knowing that the Anacortes Community Forest has kind of emerged as a topic where there's a lot of interesting ideas. Are there folks on the climate team that are directly or closely connected with citizen science or advisory groups that are involved in stewarding the Anacortes Community Forest? I was just curious if in this group we have, I know Parks is closely involved.
So I previously served on the Forest Advisory Board, and I'm a member of Friends of the Forest, and I sort of do like informal, like clearing trails when there are branches down and stuff, and communicate with parks regularly about stuff out there, but it's definitely on an informal basis.
Okay, perfect. That's great to know. I'm just trying to assess whether, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm also a member of Friends of the Forest as well, so,
Okay.
but very informal.
Perfect. That's really helpful to know. I just want to get a sense of if we start to have questions or want to have a more focused discussion on the Anacortes Community Forest as part of that January meeting, if we might want to reach out and invite some additional folks rather than setting up a whole nother meeting. Oh yeah, go ahead. Okay, that's who I was wondering. Okay, perfect. And again, we can talk with staff about the best approach to this, but I just wanted to kind of get a sense of better sense from folks in the room first before we started setting up additional meetings. Okay, that kind of covers the business on our end. Do you guys have any questions or follow-ups? I know we haven't had a meeting since the open house. Did you guys have questions or experiences that you wanted to share after the open house? Okay, well, we're happy to dig into the conversation, but we're going to be discussion-based tonight. This presentation is just sort of the beginning. The agenda is in front of you, and that's yours to take home on. We're going to start, flip to the guiding principles is next. But I want to just bring your attention to the handout is a kind of worksheet for you to use throughout the conversation. And we'd love to kind of take that, not take it from you, but get your feedback on those forms. So if you have notes on the discussion, so we'll be referring to that handout a few times during the presentation and to give you a chance to kind of think through things without us talking too much at you and let you kind of think through some questions. So we'll dig into that a little bit more once we get there, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what was sitting in front of you. So the guiding principles, we introduced these at our first meeting and kind of did a little quick brainstorm. And then we sent these out. Sorry, I know the screen is a little cut up, but you're seeing all the text there, and it's also on your handout. There were a few comments online after we sent the document out, so we did get a few edits. And so this is the text that you're seeing in front of you, and the text on the screen is kind of where we landed. And there are a few sort of text edits, nothing all incredibly significant, but good edits and good refinements of some of the goals. The one piece I did want to call on is I suggested an edit. We had sort of action oriented as the last bullet, and I did add feasible there. And I had a comment in the document. We attended a conference. There's a recent conference that Washington Department of Commerce co-hosted a panel, and they were talking to different communities that have done climate action planning, were sharing experiences and things that had worked. And one of the things they were really identifying was that time and staff constraints has slowed implementation of some of these areas. So I just wanted to sort of add that lens to that bullet, that climate change is a really big topic and there's a desire to feel like we have to tackle everything at once. But it is okay, I think, to focus on achievable actions and really near-term opportunities while building kind of the groundwork for action over time. And I want to make sure this group feels empowered to kind of advise on those kind of decisions and not feel overwhelmed by having to tackle everything at once. So I don't know that we need to formally adopt these guiding principles, but I think we kind of wanted to say that this is kind of what we would look to if we're grappling with a decision or wanting to kind of make a determination over one pathway versus another on a goal or on a policy. These can be sort of a help to guide that process. Are folks more or less okay with moving forward with these? Perfect. And then we can talk with staff the role that these would play actually when we write the climate element. This might be something that we actually include in the text of the climate element that said this guided this process and may guide kind of future implementation steps over time. All right, so that's all the logistic ends. We're doing well on time, so that's great. I'm going to hand it now over to John Phillips, who's going to talk a little bit about vulnerable populations, and then we'll have a little handout work.
Hi, everyone. In case you didn't hear me just talking, I didn't use the microphone. John Phillips with Parametrics. We've been working on the resiliency portion of the climate element with makers, and Beth is here representing the greenhouse gas sub-element. We shared the story map on Anacortes that had what was called the Climate Element Explorer. 2 pages in there I wanted to call your attention to are the adaptive capacity and sensitivity. I'm going to do a real high overview of those. There's some really in-depth discussion on the story map about what that's representing, but more or less to get your feedback on what you see in those maps from the community perspective and what you know about Anacortes versus what the data is telling us. So sensitivity is a measurement that we use in an index. So in other words, we have a climate vulnerability index. It says how vulnerable are the different areas of Anacortes to climate change. And that would include both a sensitivity, which you'll see here, which is a lot of health factors, right? There's people with different types of terminal diseases. What is the age? What kind of health issues do we see? We want to kind of identify those to see if there's pockets of vulnerable population. It's a small area, right? It's not to be discredited, but it's a small area, so we can actually see smaller pockets. And what we want to do is say that within those areas, there's populations that we should be identifying that might have some sensitivity. So some of those exposures, which are the climate impacts that we talked about at our last meeting, like heat, wildfire, sea level rise, things like that, where they might not have the capability or the impacts actually impact them differently than they might another population. So for instance, people with COPD and asthma would be more sensitive to heat or to smoke, and they'd also be sensitive to heat too. So those are the kind of things we just want to have a good sense of where the populations are. This comes into the resiliency planning as we start looking at what are we going to do, how are we going to adapt, what are some of the benefits, and where should we put those if we think about the resiliency of the community. So those are the factors we consider. That's kind of a score. And when you look at this page, you'll see that it's kind of the darker color, the darker green color, they are more sensitive than the other colors. So we're seeing more population. Now we can get in there and really break it down and say, okay, are we seeing areas where there's populations over the age of 65? Are there places in there we should be kind of highlighting as far as maybe retirement areas, homes or things like that that specialize for senior adults? Where are all the children? And then just kind of in general, where do we see populations with more diseases? I'm going to ask a couple of questions here at the end, so I hope you're all paying attention. The other part of this is what we call the adaptive capacity. So that's a score we also kind of feed in. And that's the ability for people to do something about the environment they're in, right? So we look at a lot of different factors there. These are all coming from the Census Bureau, American Community Survey. So we do like the ground truth. We do like to say, does that make sense? Do you see a lot of population with limited English speaking skills? Older homes, they do consider as a factor in there, like if you have a lot of homes, and it's actually the house built prior to 1965. And that really goes back to what were the building codes at the different times and when did things change in the housing. We can also dig in a little bit deeper too, if we want to look at that. Like if you do probably have a lot of older homes in Anacortes, but if we were somewhere where there's a lot of newer homes, we could go between like 85 and 65 when when different building codes might have changed. So we can look at that kind of ability for that house to withstand, say, a heat wave. How kind of insulation do they have? What housing types are in there? So difference between a stick-built house to a manufactured home to multifamily, things like that. We want to kind of understand that. That's the ability for that population to actually respond to some sort of adverse event, right? So think of it from that perspective. If I don't have a car and I'm told to evacuate, how do I evacuate the city of Anacortes, right? How do I get out of here? I have two ways out, and they both kind of require cars, unless I'm going to go jump on a boat somewhere. The other thing is, of course, limited English speaking skills. We can break that down too. So that's things like when you communicate, are you making sure that communication covers the populations that are within those areas? So we want to look at all that in whole, but we also can break it down so we can understand what of those factors are in there. And that helps us kind of understand, like, as we go through these different climate impacts, we'll be talking about probably in January, even more in depth, which are the heat, the wildfire smoke, sea level rise, what's happening, and how are those populations going to be able to respond to that, and what kind of resources do they have, and what kind of resources should we be thinking about, and what are those benefits we might have, some measures that we might identify to actually address those impacts, and how can that benefit those different populations. So on your agenda, you have some areas to kind of fill out if you don't want to speak up, but I'm gonna, how much time we have? 10 minutes? 20?
You're going to spend about 10 minutes to give you guys 10 minutes to kind of walk through the questions, kind of provide some responses, and then we can do about 5 minutes of discussion is kind of what we had mapped out for this. And we can, if folks go through the questions quickly, we can have more discussion or we can extend it a little bit. But we wanted to give you guys a chance to kind of look at the maps, and we can scroll, we can kind of flip back and forth, but just to kind of walk through the questions. And see, are there things that are surprising you? What we're trying to get from you all tonight from your feedback is whether what we're showing on the maps resonates with your understanding of both population sensitivity and adaptive capacity for Anacortes. Yeah.
Okay, got it. So I had a question about some of the demographic information, and I understand a lot of it comes from the census. Is that down to heart disease, COPD, asthma, diabetes? Where does that information come from?
That actually comes from the CDC, and then we check in with Skagit Health too if they have any additional data, but most of it's coming from CDC. And that's actually in the Washington Health Disparities Map. So the state of Washington actually brought all that data in, and then we can grab that data and bring it into our own maps so we can understand that. So that's from the perspective of where are those things being reported at, like hospitals and clinics, and what are the people's zip codes. So that's about the level of information we would know. And then they take that and they say, okay, well, this zip code has XYZ. How does that relate to a census block or to a census tract? So the statisticians at CDC will do that breakdown so we can see it in this format. I mean, we can obviously see it at zip code level, but we'd rather see it at the block level just because it's a lot smaller for an area like Anacortes.
So if it's not by, like in this instance, we're pretty much 98221, but when people fill out that information on their medical forms, they can get it down this granular to, I live in this neighborhood, for example, and I have COPD. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
But we're not supposed to know that.
Right, exactly. It's anonymous.
That's the kind of,
okay.
there's a and Katie and I have been talking, there's a barrier between like how that data is collected and what you can actually find out about an individual within that community. So when we go down to the census block, we're right at that fine line of making sure we don't be able to identify any individual within that group that can be, pinpointed to what's your HIPAA, right? Your health privacy. So that you volunteered to hear was really nice. But yes, that's kind of how it comes out. There's a lot of probably, that's why we like to ground truth it. We'll call this ground truthing. We can say, does that make sense? Does that look like something you would expect? Obviously where your community forest kind of up through the middle there isn't a huge population, so it doesn't show up as adaptive. But when you get to the impacts of wildfire, then that place would actually show up pretty strongly because it's mostly forested. So we just kind of use it as a guide to say what areas of the city up, if we were in a larger area, say like a county or even a state level, this would be more of a highlight of where do we want to focus. And because the census blocks are so small, there's a lot of overlap in the data, but they can kind of get a little bit granular for us. And it's statistics, you know, what percentage of that population would have it and how does that break down within that smaller geographic area.
Does each of the index components have a value? And then the difference is the aggregate of that? And then are they weighted in any way, or are they all equal value?
They are not weighted at this time. So what we've done is we've equalized each of the indexes to kind of say all indexes are created equally, even if they have more data points within them and more metrics. So they're not any kind of bias towards any one score. And the scores are on the map. You might not be able to see it. But if you look really closely, you can see there's like a 63.1 for the area that's kind of covering the port area. And when you're online, you can see the score value. And then that color corresponds to a number that then we put in and plug in and we kind of multiply them together and then we get our final vulnerability index. But nothing's weighted at this time. You can look at that. You can come back. You can decide as a group to say, hey, we want to weight X or Y more. We can be very flexible on how it's weighted. But what we've done is we've taken any bias out of any one index by weighting everything equally.
So yeah, kind of same question along that line. You see a heavy dark area, but so what you're telling me is that could be just older homes, and that could be a really high number because that's just, you know, original town site for Anacortes. That may be a very, very high number, and maybe living alone could be a very small number in there.
Yes. And each of these, the indexes we considered, we have individual scores for those as well, that we can actually click on that census block in another map and actually see that breakdown. Is it being driven by older homes? Is it being driven by low income? Is it being driven by X or Y? What's really making that score? And then each of those individual indexes are scored against all the other census blocks within the city. So we can actually rank like what's the number one area for people with the oldest homes, right? We can do that. We can make that tool available, but it's a lot of just little details within there. If you go to the Snohomish County Vulnerability Index, they've got a full website. I'm going to brag about it because we helped them do it, but they actually took it to another level once we turned it over to them. And of course, everything's color coded, but you can see all the breakdown of information in there. And we can provide that as well, as that breakdown of information, like what's driving that score. Maybe it's multiple things, right? And we see that a lot too. So
if we're going to be making decisions or stuff based on that, I mean, you can say that's a very dark zone. It's a highly sensitive population, but if it's just one thing that's driving it, I guess having the breakdown of information would be helpful.
Yeah, we could. That's really important to understand, and that's why we definitely look at that, and that's what we do. We first see it is we go, what's driving that, and kind of make note of what we see there. The area kind of right through the middle of your downtown is really driven, like you said, by the older homes. Yeah, that's a big driver there. And also we see some pockets of lower income as well. And if you drive into town, you see multifamily typically shows up as lower income. And that's either truth or it's a bias from the American Community Survey. I don't know.
Okay. All of the factors listed up there don't surprise me at all in terms of being on that adaptive capacity index, excuse me, except for the very first one, low population density. And I was wondering if you could explain the relevance of low population density to essentially the being a vulnerable population or being I mean, why is that relevant?
That's my favorite question. When you live far away from your neighbors, you can't depend on them as much, right? It's kind of that thing where if you're out in the middle of nowhere versus where you're in town, you know, you have neighbors or you have a support system. So population density makes the score, if it's really dense, it makes the score lower, whereas it's more spread out, it will possibly be a higher score. And that is actually something we looked at as far as the information that's given when we look at this vulnerability. Like we didn't make this up. Parametrics didn't make this up. We looked around and looked at that data. So what we get concerned about is when you have pockets and isolation of homes out in a more rural area, that you're accounting for folks and what's going on there. If they have a low population density, they don't have that support. Like the neighbor doesn't come bang on the door and say your house is on fire, right? Your neighbor's not going to probably run, you have to drive the truck over to say, hey, your house is on fire.
So to that point, I mean, it's low population density makes sense in a rural or something area, but
Mhm.
it's downtown Anacortes. You can walk anywhere. The hospital's right there. So I just think we need to maybe look at the factors and say, okay, is this really relevant to, does that create somebody a sensitivity for a population, just low population density?
And
downtown?
we like to look at that. Then we look at like, where are the homes? And then we can actually, sometimes when we're in some of these rural areas, we can say, like, is that an older population living by themselves out in a home on a 10 to 15 acre plot where they might not get any information? How isolated are they from that? And that's just something that we keep in the back of our head as we're looking through these things.
Well, since we're a city, does it make sense to have that in there at all? Because it sounds like low population density really is an issue in rural areas, and we don't have any rural areas in a city.
Right. We can go through and see how it scores. And if there are any areas that have the highest rank, we'll see what the percentage is, right? We'll see what it looks like. And if it looks like it's pretty much a uniform across the city, then we can say, yeah, we can take that out. It's a possibility too. I think that's great feedback.
So another question I'm thinking is that this is a very small geographic area. And are we really planning at this granular level, like certain neighborhoods are going to be treated differently? Are we going to plan down to this level? I mean, aren't we a little bit broader than that? We're like our town. And so, I might be on the border of one of these. I mean, it's cool. It's interesting demographic information, but how much is this going to affect our actual planning as a city?
It gives you a sense of what your population's challenges are when it comes to looking at resiliency measures, but that measure or that goal or that policy will affect the entire city. And I think the next thing, and what they want us to do, the state wants us to do, is kind of give a recognition to how different things might benefit different areas of the city. So that's why we break it down to this level. So we'll do a lot of that, like, how does that impact population X, Y, or Z? Because we're going to have to document that as far as how we look at the climate element. So that's the quote unquote environmental justice, right at the end of the whole. Your requirements for the climate element are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And number 3 says, and then consider environmental justice. So we have this data, we can look at it, we can understand it, we can talk to you about what makes sense, what doesn't. But overall, you're right. The measures and the goals and policies we develop are going to be citywide. What we do then is we have a recognition there might be other areas where there's challenges to that kind of goal or policy. And how do we kind of incorporate that into what we do with the city overall? And maybe there's nothing, maybe it's all pretty uniform. There's pockets here that are this or that. There's older homes. Yeah, we know we need to retrofit those, but that's something we can talk about once we start getting into a little bit more granularity about what the policies and goals are. But it's information.
Yeah, and data's great and the maps visually okay, but to your point, it's an Anacortes plan. We're making recommendations for Anacortes. I'd be more interested in, okay, how many people of color in Anacortes? We've got a population of what, 15,000? Okay, we've got 10%, or how many low income? I don't necessarily care where they are because they're all over. I've delivered food for one of the, I forget which organization, but yeah, we're going into really nice neighborhoods and it's pretty well mixed. So I think just Anacortes as a general, how many people are living alone? And then decide, okay, that's a very vulnerable population across the board, across the map of Anacortes.
So I'm kind of wondering too, like, I'm just thinking about maybe some of the more vulnerable people that are living in the campgrounds and stuff like that. Do those people actually get recorded at all? And they could be some of the most vulnerable, all the people that we have on the island, and they're probably not even being counted for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have quite a few students that, they want to be in the Anacortes School District. They can't afford anything. They are living in campers, stuff like that. So.
And that's exactly the kind of information and ground truthing that why we're sharing these maps tonight, because the data only tells so much. But you folks living on the ground in the community really can kind of inform so that we aren't putting kind of too much emphasis in one area and not covering broadly. I think another key piece, and I think John's spoken to this, but another way of phrasing it or framing it is that we're looking for patterns across multiple maps. And so we're kind of showing you two specific maps tonight to kind of see, are there surprises here? Are we missing information? We just heard a really good piece of that, that's not maybe capturing this, and it's going to be moving around, so it isn't going to be captured on the map per se, but it's something to keep in mind. But what we're going to be as a team, and what John's team has definitely been doing to date, is really looking for those patterns that we're seeing show up again and again, or where there's changes. And there's a pretty interesting change just between these maps. If you want to go back to the sensitive populations, where we have sort of sensitive populations spread out across the whole city. But when you go back to the adaptive capacity, there's definitely areas that have higher adaptive capacity than others. So those kind of patterns is what this data is telling us, and what we'll be looking at as we kind of do and wrap up the climate vulnerability.
I just wanted to mention, when I was looking over the measures, the examples of policies and goals, and thinking about the sensitivity mapping, I think there is some overlap there. An example would be heat resilience and land use and density, and how that can create dense zoning can create heat bubbles in urban planning. And that could be right where you have an area that's less adaptive and higher sensitivity. So I think there is a nexus between policy and some of this granularity in the mapping.
Use the microphone, Katie.
I was just asking, and sorry for folks online, I was just repeat my question. I was just seeing if folks wanted to spend time with the questions, or if the discussion is working really well for us, but I want to make sure you guys have a chance to kind of think through things. So.
And as you think of things, please fill this out, or you can just email us too.
So are we going to be able to get to the granularity of those? I mean, again, it's nice visually, but are we going to have the ability to look on there and say, okay, how many people have asthma? How many people are in older homes in the Anacortes?
The map that drives these maps is readily available for you to use and look at.
Yeah, we don't have the climate map Explorer tool pulled up, but when you go into the Explorer tool, I hope you had a chance to do that. And if not, please spend a little time after this meeting. You can actually click into some of those areas, and you don't get kind of all the raw data, but you get in more information, and it gives you a sense of what is ranking high within a lot of those. So, so yeah, there's even in the story map, or in the tool that went out, you'll be able to get a little bit of that information.
And will that have the source data? Because I know with the state's map impacted communities, when you dig down to the actual data, you'll find it's a CDC report from 2002 or 2012. Some of the data, it's just good to be able to truth back to where the core of the data is.
Yeah, and if you don't see it, you can always ask us. We have that in our the back end tool we use to kind of actually drive the score. And we actually sort through that when we go. We like, okay, well, it's better. We use data source X or data source Y, because it'll give us, it's the same input, but what data source is better. And we love local data. So Skagit County Health Department had something that we could use. That would be our go-to piece of data. We still have access to what the CDC, and we can compare. But we do look at what are the best sources of data that we have available to us for specifically for Anacortes. And it might not be the same thing we use for Skagit County. It might not be the same thing we use for Island County. So.
I'm just out of curiosity, the low income factor, do you know what level is used? Is that 100% of the federal poverty line, or is that an area median income level, like 80% or less, or 50% or less of area median income? I'm just curious what low income is defined as.
I depend on my spreadsheets too much to know that data.
Okay.
That would be the statewide poverty level would go for income level, lower income, I believe.
So
But
probably
we can look at how that data was actually, that's exactly how is that data sourced and what are they using?
Okay.
So there's lots of data on what low income, quote unquote, low income. So I'd have to dig in and see which one we actually use, but that's easy enough to answer.
It's just a point of curiosity because I
Yeah.
know there's different levels. There's a lot of things are measured by 100% of the federal poverty line or 150 or 200, or for area median income, 30%, 50%, 80% are really typical. So that's where I'm just wondering what was
Right.
used as the measure. It's not
Yeah.
that important.
And we
but-
include housing burden costs just for that kind of
Yeah.
second check on it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. And housing cost burden also, I assume that's more than 30% of income being spent on housing. Okay.
That one I know. Sorry.
Any other questions on this before we head over or move on to the next section? You're also welcome to follow up if you go to check the Climate Explorer and have a follow-up. So I think in the interest of that, we can move on to the next section. But you're also welcome if thoughts occur to you later on in the meeting or you want to jot notes down, please do use the worksheets. We're happy to take those at the end of the day. All right, so Beth is going to be walking through kind of a discussion on GHG measures and leading that discussion. But before we do that, I wanted to just introduce a little bit of recent feedback that we've had. Let me just grab my notes. So we've had feedback on 2 separate events and we've asked a couple of different questions each one. So I wanted to just share back because some of that is relevant to tonight. So thinking back all the way to June, at the June open house, we did sort of a poll survey. And in the bottom, we had about over 100 people attended the meeting. Some came and went. We had about approximately 62 people who took the survey either in the room via the live poll or on a paper copy. So when I say 51% of respondents, it's 51% of that 62 people. So not a huge number, but still, a significant amount for them meeting and helpful information to sort of get started with. So 51% of those respondents had taken some steps to reduce greenhouse emissions in their homes. Top barriers or challenges that they'd encountered were costs, whether it's cost of building improvements, new heating, cooling systems, and or hybrid electric vehicles. Those are all different questions, but the cost barrier really is what unifies them. Not feeling safe or comfortable walking and biking was another barrier that people reported that was keeping them from maybe biking more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or walking more. And transit service not meeting their needs, that there was a desire, maybe they might use transit more often, but it just wasn't quite getting them exactly where they needed to go. Energy conservation and lighting efficiency were the most common actions that folks had taken. And we were trying to structure these questions around like, what have you done? What kind of actions have you taken to not sort of get the aspirational thing, kind of get a sense of on the ground, what are folks doing in Anacortes? Fewer reported making larger investments, adding solar panels, making efficient heating and cooling improvements. Many respondents are walking and biking, so that was very popular. And a smaller number were using transit, but a smaller number. And then 13% of the respondents reported not having considered any of the actions, that it just wasn't a priority for them. And then in the October open house, I just have one bullet here and then some notes. But there was a desire for action, wanting to see the city move forward from data to implementation. We've heard from a few folks kind of emphasize that. And there are a number of ideas that were kind of just mentioned at the meeting. So I'll just mention them here because they kind of relate to the topics, or some of them relate to topics we'll be talking about. Incentives for home energy efficiency, promoting smaller sized homes, which are more efficient. Garbage pickup every other week to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, investing in bike infrastructure, and reducing food waste. So those are just some ideas that emerged from the open house for your awareness as you're kind of we're discussing actions today. And then coming back to sort of what our goal is for today, we talked a little bit about this in the context of what we just wrapped up. In terms of the environmental justice. But where our focus today is really reviewing and discussing some initial measures. We're mostly at the kind of goal level. If you think about a comprehensive plan, there's goals and then policies to support, and that's where we're headed for the climate element. We're sort of a little high, we're going to sort of be focused a little on the higher level, but we are including examples of policies that could be supporting those goals. We're going to use the word measure several times tonight, and that really just relates to the tool that we sent out, the Washington State Commerce Guidance on Climate Policy. They've developed a whole list, and many, if you looked at that, you can see a bunch of what they're calling measures of ways that different communities are reducing emissions. So we'll be using that word tonight. And then the environmental justice piece we talked about, but what we're kind of looking for guidance on what the team should prioritize when refining the measures that we discussed tonight into those draft goals and policies for the climate element. And then also feedback from each of your perspectives on current efforts and priorities. There's some questions on the next page of your handout that speak to that, and some may apply, some may not, depending on your work or your position. But just trying to get a sense of what is going on in the community, what barriers have you what barriers may you have encountered, and what are the next steps of those actions. We've spoken a little bit to this. I don't want to skip over it. It's important. But from an environmental justice perspective, there's a lot of pieces that may be clear from that, but there's some pieces that might not be clear. So some of the things that we highlighted here. So fostering denser development and diverse housing types can align with affordable housing goals. So it might be surprising that that shows up as a climate measure, but there's actually a lot of land use and housing related things that actually are beneficial to both, that are beneficial to the climate element and identified in Commerce's tool. Another piece for the environmental justice is considering the financial burden for lower income populations. So incentives versus requirements. And then the final goals and policies, what approaches should be taken, whether you have a broad program or a targeted program to sort of support key populations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Co-benefits is another piece, and this will come out a lot as we introduce the resilience at the next meeting, the resilience measures, but there will be often co-benefits for different areas. So there can be co-benefits of pollution reduction from transportation, building energy and waste heat. So that can be not only are you getting the emissions reduction, but you also can get that co-benefit for public health. Workforce building, there can be economic benefits from making investments in programs or other strategies to sort of increase workforce and training to support transition. And that can have really broad and beneficial economic benefits to multiple populations. And then just a really core piece is just our vulnerable populations being served. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Beth, who will be probably a little over on time, but this is really the focus of the rest of the presentation. So Beth, I will hand it over to you. Let me just turn, I think if you start, there we go.
Great. Can you see me? I guess I'm still minimized, but whatever, you don't really need to see me. All right, so I just want to start with this broad graphic showing the different sources of emissions in Anacortes, just so that we're all sort of on the same page. I know that you guys have watched previous presentations on the greenhouse gas inventory and have, seen the report and all that kind of stuff. So here I'm just reminding you that in Anacortes, so the colored bars on the left are your local emissions. So building energy, transportation energy, waste disposal, industrial process, mostly refrigerants. And then we've got nice sequestration from your beautiful forest. And then the sort of purpley red bars on the right are emissions done on behalf of you, right? For the things that you buy. So that's, all the upstream, all the emissions it took to make your food, to make your stuff, to make the fuel that then you burn in your car, which is in your transportation emissions column. So, so we're focusing this sort of set of measures around the local emissions, which are the ones that Commerce is requiring us to address, and especially building energy and transportation energy. And so on the next slide, okay, great. On the next slide, I'm just showing sort of a projection of how the current existing state and federal policies are going to affect your local emissions. So as you can see, it's pretty, there's a lot of work being done on a lot of levels to bring down your emissions. But you will notice that sort of at the end of this story, there's still a lot of green bars. Those are in your transportation, and sort of your blue bars, especially that sort of natural gas and other non-electricity building fuels bar. So those are the things that are really left over that still really need local action to address. And so we're going to talk about developing goals and policies that can support bringing down those building emissions, reducing diesel emissions, policies that support ferry decarbonization. So that's that purple bar is going down as the ferry system decarbonizes, supporting the EV transition to make sure that reduction in passenger cars happens, and then also supporting sort of the electricity transition. That means supporting the electricity grid as it transitions to more renewable electricity sources. All right, so next, let's talk about just generally, this is sort of at a high level. How does this happen? Like, what are the things that need to happen to be able to actually reduce building emissions at like an even higher level than we'll get into? And again, building emissions are mostly due to electricity and natural gas. And electricity emissions are required by law to decrease through time until they are zero by 2045. Natural gases emissions are not required to do that. So we expect electricity emissions to sort of decrease and go away. And we don't expect to see that same change in the natural gas emissions. And just a lot of when we're planning, we're thinking about what new buildings are going to go in and what, new houses, all that sort of future building. But I just want to remind us all that the existing buildings, all the buildings that are built and existing right now, are going to continue to be your biggest source of building emissions because that's most of your buildings, right? You're not going to totally turn over your housing supply in the next 20 years. So to address those emissions, one big way is through efficiency, basically decreasing your energy needs in buildings. It reduces the electricity emissions in the near term and maintains electrical grid capacity in the long term, even once electricity emissions go to zero. Natural gas efficiency reduces emissions overall through time. And then I wanted to note that smaller and attached housing units use less energy than bigger and unattached housing units. So that has a lot to do with all the densification and land use policies that we're going to talk about. Bringing housing closer together, smaller housing, all is more efficient, along with a lot of other things. The other way of reducing building emissions is through electrification. Basically, anytime you switch from natural gas to electricity, you reduce emissions for whatever it was you were doing with that. And finally, generation. So this is solar mostly, most easily, most availably, but any kind of renewable energy sources that you can develop in your town, reduce emissions, and also build grid capacity and resilience through time. Okay. All right. And then any questions sort of about that high level? How do we decrease building emissions?
Head shake, so keep
Okay.
on going.
All right. Next, we're going to address the green bars. So that's all of your transportation emissions. So on the next slide, so basically those emissions come from two major sources. One is passenger cars, and to reduce passenger car emissions, we need to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And you can do that a lot of that is done through, you know, land use policy and transportation policy. That's another place where that densification goal comes in when things are close together. People don't need to drive as much. And another thing to note about VMT, while it's definitely can result in a lot of good things, through time as cars electrify, VMT and GHG reductions sort of become uncoupled. So that's just something to keep in mind as time goes on and our cars become more electric. We still need to understand the benefits of reducing VMT apart from just the GHG ones. Yeah, so there's a lot of quality of life and environmental justice benefits that come along with reducing VMT. The other major way to reduce passenger car emissions, and the way that it's modeled to be reduced in sort of the existing policy forecast, is through car electrification. So these electric car rules will eventually force adoption, just because you won't be able to buy a new gas car. But additional infrastructure is necessary to actually allow for that switch. If we think about all of the gas stations that are all over the place that support our gas car usage, we need to think about how we can provide that same kind of system support for electric vehicles. Okay, and then the rest of your transportation emissions basically come from diesel and watercraft, although I do want to note that there's a little bit of emissions from your airport in there too. But most of the rest of it is from diesel and watercraft. And this is a little bit harder to address in general. But one way is through electrification. There's already plans in the works for the ferry system to electrify. So it's possible for other craft as well to electrify. And then for those things that are too hard or like the technology is not there yet for electrification, we're looking at alternative fuels. In this case, that's mostly renewable diesel, so also known as R99. And that's a product that is becoming increasingly available thanks to sort of carbon markets and clean fuel standards. It's available in general at the same price as fossil diesel. And it has about, between 30 and 40% of the emissions of fossil diesel. So it's a real substantial reduction in emissions there. Any questions on the transportation emissions?
No question.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to sort of jump into, as Katie mentioned, we're going to be talking about these sort of high level, well, a little bit lower level goals that the city can include in its comprehensive plan to address these emissions. So we're going to start with sort of these land use and housing measures. Like I said, both building energy and transportation energy are addressed by sort of densification and more intense land use. So in this case, the goal would be to foster higher intensity land uses in sort of mixed use areas of Anacortes. And there's a bunch of sort of example policies that Anacortes could enact, such as, changing the zoning policies, prioritizing infill, increasing density limits, and then updating the codes to better integrate higher density development. Yeah,
Beth,
so
sorry, Beth, I'm just going to jump in here too.
Discuss.
Our team also, because Makers is also involved in the development of the land use, and that has been moving ahead, was ahead of the climate element, has been moving forward. So they're already at the draft goals and policies. The example policy measures that we have listed here that were identified in the commerce tool are those that really align with what you already have in your land use element and the direction that you're already headed. So we're not necessarily saying an overhaul of the land use element to do more. We're saying these are the measures that you're already going in this direction with the draft goals and policies that have been working through the process already.
So the recommendations from the Department of Commerce are those, do they have different recommendations for, say, Seattle versus Anacortes? Or are these just blanket recommendations for zoning changes?
They are, the sort of list of measures is generally applicable to all of the communities, but it's up to the communities to choose which ones are appropriate for them.
And we did a little bit of that as we were sort of selecting. So if you've been in the tool, you know, there's a lot more measures. There's like several hundred in there, and they both support both the resilience element and the greenhouse gas element. We did do some review and coordination with the land use element to identify the ones that were most aligned to the direction of the land use. And it's also the level at which you take these. So when you say increasing density, we're not talking about buildings the size of, you know, skyscrapers the way they have in Seattle. It's scaled to the scale of the community. So in a change in increasing density in Anacortes is going to look different than increasing density in Seattle, if that makes sense.
And then recommendations were include something like a fee. I see the single family home impact fee on utility, I guess, charges for single family homes. Where do those fees go? Are the fees supposed to be put in place to help like Anacortes meet its goals, or is this just fees to guide behaviors? So the more expensive it is, the less likely you are to buy a single family home if it becomes more expensive because of fees.
So the potential measures are additional items that we saw in the commerce guidance, and that also aligned with some policies that the city has in the books, but would require sort of expansion to sort of meet the greenhouse gas. So this one is looking at single family home impact fees, which the city already has, as well as facility charges. But the idea is expanding that to sort of account for greenhouse gas emissions or utility use within a building. So larger homes maybe being charged more or having a higher impact fee. These are potential measures, and tonight we're here to discuss whether your feedback on these. So we're not proposing these. We're really here to discuss what's resonating. We kind of highlighting that we aren't overhauling the land use element. We want to say we're sort of selected those measures in the sort of this section here that really kind of align with where the direction of the land use element is already going for the city. But we're really here tonight to hear from you as to what's resonating and what would be most effective.
And I want to say something to that. And I think there's unintended consequences sometimes of densification, and that we really need to look at the urban design and have like green belts or corridors and maintain our green infrastructure in order to maintain climate resilience as we get, you know, hotter, as the climate gets hotter. We need to look at our urban design and densification. A lot of the development in dense areas and losing green infrastructure, we can lose some of the eco benefits of living things in our urban areas. The cooling effect, the stormwater filtering. There's a lot of benefits from having those green corridors and beltways.
Absolutely. And that is definitely part of this planning process is, I mean, there's a whole section that we're going to talk about on trees, but making sure that nature is, and green space and cooling, natural cooling is considered along with densification. They don't necessarily have to be, you know, totally at odds. But I appreciate that it's important to do it smartly. And that's what we're trying to do.
So I just wanted to bring up another thing we're doing in tandem with this whole process is the city adopted a housing action plan in January of 2023, and it has a list of suggestions, and Makers helped us with that also. And some of these things are also detailed there. And again, it's not a roadmap per se of these are the things we'll do, but there are levels of low hanging fruit and upwards of that. So we're looking at those things at the same time.
And I just have a question for clarification. I actually don't know what infill development is. I was wondering if you could define what infill development is up there in the second bullet from Department of Commerce.
Infill development can be thought of as, I mean, not necessarily, I'm not speaking specifically to Anacortes, but if you have parking lots and you want to bring more of a mixed use area or kind of bring the new development to create more density, it's creating more development opportunity within an existing area. So taking underutilized areas or parking lots. And I'm not speaking specifically to Anacortes in an example there, just that's broadly what the term means. So one thing that we're looking tonight, and again, there's in the next page of your handout, there's sort of, as we walk through, you can kind of jot down notes. We'd love to kind of hear from you. It's like, this is a policy I'd like to see more. This is a goal that I'd like to see more. I like these policies, but not this one. Those are the kind of feedback we'd love to get. From here, we're going to be taking this feedback and these measures and kind of translating those into draft goals and policies. So we've done kind of a first pass at what we think is relevant in the direction we might go. But we really are using tonight's discussion to, again, ground truth, get a kind of pulse on what's going to be most effective. So I'd love, as well as comments through discussion, just your notes or your thoughts on the handouts. We haven't talked a lot about the ensuring public transit stops and stations near those dense commercial and employment centers. We know there's, existing service in Anacortes, and then we heard also from public feedback, there's a desire. I'd love to hear a little bit more about some opportunities for that, as well as some of the potential barriers in the community about maybe increasing transit, or if there's key areas that you're hoping to serve in the near term, or in your near term to middle term planning that we should be aware of. And this could be either from comprehensive plan discussions or also amongst the group.
So I noticed you don't have a transportation element that's non-bus. So, I mean, separated bike lanes, bike only streets,
Yeah,
lanes where bikes can go and cars can't go, things like that would increase the bikeability that was commented on earlier. So maybe something of that nature, pedestrian bike mode in your transportation plan would be helpful. I mean,
yeah,
I know we have that in the city, but
perfect.
I don't see it there.
Yeah, we have an active transportation slide kind of in a few slides, but that's a really good point. And these things we've had to sort of create some, like, this is this slide. I know this, when you're talking about urban design, it all overlaps and touches one another. So there are some artificial we're starting high level at land use. The next one's a little bit more focused on housing, and then we'll talk transportation. But that's a really good point to really need to consider how that overlaps with land use and how those pieces fit together.
So just so I understand the process as the climate group, we're kind of seeing these different policy measures. Will there be a time where we sit down and go through these and talk about them and kind of,
Yes.
does this work? Okay.
Yeah.
Future meeting.
Yeah, we're still fine tuning exactly when we bring these as draft goals and policies to you. These are still kind of at the measure goal stage. What we're really hoping to get from tonight is like a lot of support for this area, questions about this area, not sure about this area. And I have a good kind of cross discussion, both involving staff as well as members of the community on the why those sentiments are there, why those impressions are there. That's what we're trying to get. We'll take all of that information, develop draft goals and policies, and then share those back with you.
So one of the things that I've been talking about at different meetings and planning committee meetings and others of the maintain and update form-based codes to better integrate higher density development, so that essentially a lot of the decisions are made with the code and at the planning stage rather than the permitting stage. So people don't show up with permit applications and it's a changing field. So to have real consistency and make sure we do that as well as we can in our regulations so that it's a smoother process for people that are building and for developers so that they know what to expect going in. So it's not a lot of time and cost to drag this process out as has happened in the past. So that's something that I think is important going forward, rather than having conditional uses that take up a lot of time and money and they help, those prevent the necessary housing from actually being built. And that's been an ongoing conversation. There's lots that we could talk about that for a while, but we probably shouldn't. But anyway, just wanted to mention that.
Sometimes that reduces the amount of public involvement in certain projects, because people don't have a chance to comment on things going up in their neighborhoods until they're at the permitting phase and it's too late.
Right. Like I said, this is probably not the time to really delve into that, because that, yeah, sure. And yeah, we can talk about that another time for sure. But yeah, point taken.
As the resident land use planner, I'm well aware that this can take up the whole meeting. So Beth, if you're okay, this is really great feedback and we are recording everything and taking notes, but we have other slides to get through. Beth, are you okay if we kind of move to the next one?
Yeah, let's move along. We'll next one's on housing too. So, and this goal is really more about, so this is increase housing diversity and supply in the urban growth areas. So this is more, again, it's sort of more inclusionary zoning, more diverse types of housing, which in this case really means, I mean, it boils down to relative to the past. It means more multifamily housing, more smaller housing, more attached housing. So these are all more efficient housing types, and therefore we expect them to have a drawdown effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And again, as Katie said, these are already sort of in the pot, right? These are already involved in the land use plan, already under consideration. So these are not fresh. These are getting credit for the changes that you're already in the process of making.
Yeah, these are aimed, I mean, the specific language may differ exactly, but in including these, we were selecting the ones that align with the direction of the land use and the housing element. And really want to highlight, the reason this slide is here is to just highlight the environmental justice benefits from all of these, as we're talking about needing to consider environmental justice and not create disparities. That is a requirement of the climate element. A really central way of ensuring that is making sure people have places to live and an adequate supply of affordable housing. So while it might not be the immediate thing that one thinks of in terms of climate policy, it's absolutely essential as part of the menu of measures in terms of meeting environmental justice requirements. So that's why we highlight it here. Again, we're not trying to reinvent or go in a different direction. The city is already sort of exploring and going in those, excuse me, land use and housing, but we're really just wanting to sort of show the connection and the importance of that to the climate element as well as to those elements.
And I don't know that I know this, our urban growth areas in Anacortes, is that the Sharps Corner area? Where is does that include?
It's really just an area in the eastern Padilla Heights or Fidalgo Heights, Fidalgo Heights. Out past like towards Quantum.
So and I say this because I'm curious with the EJ part of it, are we putting more housing closer to industrial? And does that meet or does that conflict with EJ goals? I mean, we just from speaking from industry, we see this at, all our facilities is it's the fence line communities which struggle and have issues being so close to industrial zones. So before they're there, that just needs to be taken in consideration if we're looking at building up more housing. Where do we want that? Do we want them right where they don't want to be, which is closer to the highway 20 and closer to those corridors or closer to industrial?
So our residential areas are not adjacent to the heavy industrial And then much of the area south of March Point is also non-residential. The only area adjacent to the industrial is the city-owned Sharps Corner property in that small little enclave over there behind the hotel.
It's just a combination. I mean, it's just, unfortunately, just because of the nature of land values, usually the places where you can expand is somewhere less desirable, which is right on a transportation corridor, which has issues, or near industrial or residential. Otherwise, you get into your forest lands, which we don't want to do.
Great feedback. The specifics of kind of where things, housing goes is really more of the land use element and the housing element to focus on, but great point. We're definitely recording that in the notes. But yeah, mostly we're sort of highlighting these as to just make that connection between both land use and housing and the climate benefits of those. If it's okay, I'm going to move to the next. And Beth, you okay with that?
Yep.
Perfect.
All right. So, as I said before, a lot of the building greenhouse gas emissions come from existing buildings. So, we're going to move into measures that can affect those as well. So this measure, this sort of goal, is to ensure that buildings use renewable energy conservation and efficiency technologies to reduce GHGs. So this includes things like retrofitting existing buildings for energy efficiency. So this would be both things like weatherization and things like heat pumps and for cooling and heating. There's also measures in here, things that you can do, like requirements of publicly owned buildings to be powered by renewable energy, right? That's something that's actually under the city's control. And then there's also requirements of new buildings that could include energy efficiency and renewable energy features. And this is already part of the Clean Buildings Act, this kind of need for new buildings to incorporate these kinds of features. So this is also an opportunity to update and refine existing comp policies. So by putting this goal in, the next time you do it again, you can refine your goals even further to emphasize energy efficiency. One program that I have seen in other communities, for example, is subsidizing the cost of ductless heat pump upgrades for lower income housing. That can either be, there's often a lot of programs that subsidize the heat pumps themselves, fewer programs that will help with all of the other costs, like, electric panel upgrades or roof fixes, all the other things that actually need to happen to be able to put in that heat pump that is often covered. So things like, so subsidizing the rest of those costs for lower income households. With all of this electrification and on the next slide, solar stuff. So this is an opportunity to really build your electrification workforce. You need people, you need electricians, you need solar installers, you need drywall installers, you need all these people to support this transition. Right. And then you can put in development incentives. So when you develop, you can incentivize density bonuses, low emissions, net zeros, things like that. So what do you think about these kinds of policies that address energy efficiency and electrification in new and existing buildings?
Just feel like a chatty Cathy tonight. Just like I brought up in a previous meeting, economic impact of policies as we put in place. Affordable housing is a huge issue, and just need to keep in mind anything we add to the cost of a building or retrofits ultimately goes into the cost of that housing and trickles down to rents or costs. So I like the ideas. I really do. We just need to keep that as part of the conversation.
So incentives versus requirements.
Sometimes you see things like, support to rentals for landlords to upgrade with the caveat that they don't uprent. You know, things like that. It's definitely sort of a balancing act. The better the house is, the more rent people charge. So it's tricky.
To piggyback off of what he said, I would also say the same for public buildings, because we're in the process of building a new facility right now. And the costs not only have building costs skyrocketed, as we all know, but the cost of the building has skyrocketed because of all of the extra energy efficiency elements that we've had to put into it. Not saying that it's a bad thing, but there has been a cost associated with that. So, and again, the money has to come from somewhere, so.
Yeah, and speaking of money, we should also remember that the state has like $3 billion just recently from the Climate Commitment Act, and that number is just going to grow. So as a city, we should be looking at any policies we want to do and say what funding might be available for that, for city buildings. If we want to put some renewable on there, hey, state of Washington, what kind of grants can you give us to help us meet these goals?
The one thing that we need to remember is with the new, the changing administration, what funds are going to be available versus it's true.
Yeah, I just know there's gonna be a lot of funds in a pot somewhere. And if we can make the case, I think that's what they're there for. That's what we're all paying for, our carbon emissions, is to offset them somehow. And we can make our buildings more efficient, state buildings, city buildings, then that funding we should be able to make a good case for it.
Just wanted to add that I'm really supportive of the idea of building the electrification workforce too. Just economic development, more jobs in Anacortes also then results in people being closer, jobs in Anacortes for people to walk to, maybe take less transportation to, which also then affects less greenhouse gas emissions. So very supportive.
Are there key gaps in the workforce that people have encountered from an electrification or design standpoint? We asked this question at the first open house and didn't get a lot of specific feedback, but I'm just curious to ask that again of this group, if there's trouble finding contractors to do heat pump install or weatherization, if folks in this room just have encountered that, that we might want to explore further.
Different thought in terms of subsidies for energy. Oh,
yeah, perfect.
Okay. In terms of steering or reserving subsidies for conversions and upgrades and whatever for lower income, to give a contrary thought, I think they should not. There's some thought should be given to making those also available, maybe at a lower level, to people with more means, in that the folks who have the money, yeah, they can afford it, but to offer them a bargain, because they're always looking for bargains no matter how much money they have, could tip them over towards making their conversion sooner. So it could speed that whole process up. To do that. I mean, I realize you run into that whole thing of subsidizing for people of means, but I think if it'll move the curve closer, it's something worth considering.
That's a great point. And these are not simple questions, and that there's not sort of one versus the other reasons. That's why the discussion is really important, but the value that there can be value in a broad approach, knowing that there is disparity out there, but that folks might be able to take advantage of that, and that moves the needle. So that's a great point. Thank you for that. I want to come back quickly to the public building discussion, just because that's a really key piece. And what I think I heard, but I just want to make sure we're hearing it correctly, is that there was understood that their costs have really changed, particularly impacts of inflation, and just so heard loud and clear the cost. But it sounded like there was support for seeing some sort of policy around focusing on publicly owned buildings, as long as the policy is mindful of cost availability. So the policy is written flexibly enough that it could based on available cost or accounting for that, but there was still that focusing on public buildings and reducing energy in the buildings that the city specifically can control does make sense and should be a focus. Did I hear that correctly?
think you did, and the city has done a lot of solar installations and like on the senior center and on the library. And also has gone to LED streetlights. So the city is very proactive in that. And I don't know if that's a policy that we have. We used to have a resource, an energy coordinator that he retired, but he was instrumental in getting a lot of stuff going in that way. And I mean, just like we have the EV charging station here at City Hall parking lot. And so I would just say in general, the city is very supportive and forward thinking on that. So as far as policy, I'm not sure what we have written or what else we should do, but I think there's already support. There's support for that.
I think
But
one of the troubles I typically see from like an operations standpoint is that when we build new buildings, I was at Western before here, and build a new building, put the latest and greatest in it. And one thing that I see a lot of organizations make a mistake of is like, we have this money allocated to build this and we can put all this technology in it. But then when it comes time to actually keep the facility up, we can't afford to do it because everything in it's so expensive. There's a higher failure rate because on our old building, one thing controlled this. Now we have 5 things that are controlling this because we have daylighting and dimming and all sorts of stuff like that. It's great. I love technology, but sometimes I think there's a disconnect between those two things, like keeping it up and paying for it, and the cost of it to start. So.
Beth, is there anything else you wanted to cover on this slide, or should we move to the
Oh,
next?
I
one?
think, yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think we should move along because it's already 6:20.
Sorry, the presentation keeps freezing me, so I have to escape now and again to get out of the. There, it's just a little touchy.
Right. All right. So the next goal is really addresses that energy generation goal of sort of bringing more renewables onto the grid. So this is maximize solar potential in new buildings where possible. So this is solar features on new buildings and incentivize solar panels on sort of big buildings and parking lots. Rooftop solar is this one. And again, this has a workforce element. And there's also, sometimes people have policies to install solar in public rights of way, along highways or in parks, where it's appropriate. This one's kind of specific, so.
Does Anacortes have any data? I mean, I know we did the library. I think we did the couple other public buildings with solar.
Mhm.
Do we ever go back and look at the actual return on those? Because anytime you buy anything new, the statistics are great. And then 3 years into it, you're like, oh, I'm only getting 50% of what I thought I was going to get. And I don't know about solar in Washington. I originally come from Alaska, where solar is like awesome in the summertime. But yeah, up at the cabin, I can run my refrigerator and keep my beer cold. But in the winter time, not so much on the power. The beer still stays cold. But just for any policy we do, are we looking at, from the city perspective, especially if it's public stuff, just the data to make sure that we're actually making sense? It's not just looks good, but actually works good and gets us what we're looking for, especially with solar in a town like Anacortes.
well, that would be a great place to start since we've done it recently. And I feel like I saw a report maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So I can do a little sleuthing and see what I can come up with, because we should have something.
There's always stories when you install it, and like electric school buses, and you never see the story 5 years later. Did it pan out? You really got to dig and you find some surprising stuff.
So the money we got from the Department of Commerce to put the solar on the high school, we're required to have a contract with a company to monitor and track that for up to 2 years. And I think really 2 years is a pretty good data point. Solar degrades really slow, at least the first 10, 15 years. So yeah, I think for the most part, I don't know who did your guys's or what, but yeah, we will be tracking ours and hopefully it'll pan out like we hope, so.
Yeah, because I think the data helps, and it helps what Warren got to earlier. Yeah, I could afford to put probably solar panels on my house, but I'm still not convinced that the payoff's gonna be there. But if I see that, hey, the city did it in the library or at the school and it really worked out well, that incentivizes me just from a factual basis that, okay, this probably is a good investment, even if it is expensive.
That's really helpful to know, first of all, the source potentially of local data moving forward. These are also programs that could be piloted in certain areas or targeted in certain areas and launched there where you're likely to get the biggest gain, and then launched in a broader area. So there's different ways of implementing this, or how the city might implement something like this. A similar thing was shared at the same conference that I mentioned that Commerce hosted, or this IPA conference that Commerce sort of co-hosted with communities. And they had done something similar where they launched a solar program, and then they found that it worked really well in certain areas and less well in others. So that was just part of it didn't take any way, and it didn't take away from the value of the program, but it was just the process of learning and implementation. So we could be considering of that as we're drafting goals and policies to sort of do that initial planning and utilize data within the city that is available to sort of right size the program or the focus area.
And if you're going through like the city, like we're using like an ESCO, and they're required to meet like whatever they bid that out as, they're required to meet that point. I think they tend to go a little, less, so they always are going to hit that. But they're required by the state to hit that. So if they don't, then they owe money back to you.
I also want to point out something just in case I haven't hit it, and Beth, you can speak to this further as well, probably. When we say programs, we're not at the stage yet to say like, this is the city program, this is the region. There's real opportunity to collaborate with regional partners, with the state agencies. There's a real concerted effort going on at multiple phases. So we're talking about programs broadly, not necessarily city programs. When we get to the goals and policies, we'll be providing more direction. But I think even when we are at that level, we might be talking broadly about programs, but not necessarily aligning them to one individual. So I just don't want folks to get hung up on saying we're starting so many city programs. Can we really tackle this? I don't think we need to make that decision now. The idea is just to have the sort of policy direction in place and then to figure out the best way of implementing it. And if there's any staff or Beth that want to speak further to that, I'm happy to invite them now, but yeah.
For building energy, you're really just talking about maximizing solar. I don't know if it's somewhere else on a different slide, but you should be paying just as much attention to insulation and weatherization, because building energy so much, I mean, it's all heating and cooling for the most part. And you definitely have to be paying attention to those other factors.
Absolutely. And that was the goal of the previous slide, was talking about all of, both, heat pumps but also weatherization and features on new buildings. They were kind of smushed together. But absolutely, because it's existing buildings and efficiency in those that is really gonna make a huge dent in your greenhouse gas emissions. We are getting a little short on time, so I would like to move us along to transportation. All right, so this first transportation goal is required by Commerce for this climate element, is to address VMT, to decrease vehicle miles traveled, and in this case by increasing active transportation and transit options. So the land use actions that we talked about previously also have an effect on VMT, but in this case, we're talking directly about the bike and pedestrian networks, public transportation, multimodal transportation planning, and implementing commute trip reduction programs, travel demand management, things like that. So I just wanted to note this totally intersects with the land use planning that we talked about before. But in this case, we're talking specifically about making our active transportation and transit system more appealing and more efficient. So are there places where you would really like to see a better connected active bike and pedestrian network? For example, are there like really hot spots where it feels too dangerous? Katie mentioned in her feedback from the last community meeting that one of the complaints that people had was it felt too dangerous to walk and bike. So what do you see as barriers or opportunities here?
When you're talking about danger, you're talking about fears of crime, of being assaulted, or just dealing with weaving in and out of traffic or cars not operating safely?
Yeah, my interpretation was the latter. And also to clarify, we know the transportation element has been doing great engagement with the community. We're doing a lot of events over the summer. So this is another slide where we selected policies that really kind of align with the direction of the transportation element. Transportation element has requirements to reduce in this cycle, reduce VMT. So this is another example where we're kind of moving in that same direction. So not necessarily asking for specific locations from this group tonight on areas, but speaking broadly about ways, the importance of how much focus, another way to think of this is just how much focus should we put on active transportation? Do you want to see in the climate element? I think that we can, have different levels of focus in terms of that. It seems like it makes sense for it to certainly be there, but just should this be a big focus? Should this be a focus like some of the others? I think that's what we're trying to get from this group tonight.
Yeah, sorry. I think Anacortes can be a really bikeable thing. I don't know if it needs to be all over the place, but just some central corridors to get from, if you can just get from point A to point B across town safely, and then you can get a little bit more scary into your question of safety. I'm worried more about teenagers or adults on their cell phones knocking into me on the side of the lane, but I think this is something that the city should look at. And again, not to go overboard on it with the bus system, public transportation. You got to be careful investing in something like that, because there's nothing worse than seeing a public bus and every time you see it, there's nobody on it. It's just you lose the public trust in it. So I don't know how you get around that, start small and build out with demand or how you do it. But yeah, it seems like both those should be, bikes and buses should be something we can actively work on in Anacortes.
So a couple of things, definitely create a safe, well-connected and attractive bicycle and pedestrian network. And we have made some strides in that direction. It's hard, especially if you're new in town and don't quite know where to go, because I feel like our town, the way it's laid out and the way the neighborhoods and traffic patterns are, can be a very safe place to ride. But it's tricky and it takes experience and so we can always do better there, especially for younger people or people who are going to feel unsafe to begin with. Another way of looking at this, I think, is to create more safe streets by adding traffic calming measures. And we've been talking about that at the council planning committee as well. And it's a big movement in smart towns, this organization, but if you can post all the speed limit signs you want, but we know how those work and how they don't, and enforcement similarly, they do have their advantages, but unless drivers are physically required to slow down, they're not going to. So I think coming at it from a safe streets perspective and with traffic calming is a great way to go. And in fact, a lot of grants now from the state are linked to making sure that multimodal element is included, which I think is great progress. It's like part of the directive now.
Awesome. I'm definitely hearing support. So wanting to see some good thought on active transportation policies.
Yes, I was trying to formulate what I was thinking to say. I lived in Europe for about 7 years, didn't have a car, never missed having one, used public transportation all the time. And I was just trying to figure out what was it that made it just, that made me not miss having a car. And I think part of it was ease of use. Like there was just clear information everywhere. That was the first thing. And then frequency was the second. And I wonder, as we're, I look up at that second bullet point, prioritize and promote public transit expansion and use, thinking about what are the specific things that would be easy to do that would make it more usable. Part of it just might be ease of access to information and schedules and things like that. Yeah, that's all.
What's implement commute trip reduction programs?
Thanks, I was actually going to point that one out next. There's some questions circling around transit, so I don't want to skip away from that, but I think we can also, we have some work to do after this meeting too, to coordinate more fully with transportation element, but I don't want to steer away from that conversation, but I think that's something we could also circle back with after and even within this meeting. To speak to the specific question, commute trip reduction, since we have a couple of larger employers in this group, it's also helpful to understand what is being done to reduce kind of trip, if you're, as much as you're aware, to reduce trips from to and from major employers. Are there programs that are working? What have you done? What kind of barriers have you encountered in implementing those programs? So this is sort of like carpooling programs, alternative schedules, work from home 1 day a week, those kind of things to encourage, to help reduce emissions from transportation that employers can take on, or the city could take on. The city might already be doing this to some degree. What flexibility is there? What if you have been involved in those, have you run into barriers to implementation that are making it hard to achieve those programs? So not hearing a ton of feedback on that. So that might be an You're having a hard time hearing. I'm sorry. Yeah. Just getting over a cold. That's why I have the mask on today. I apologize if that's creating an additional barrier. The question was around the commute trip reduction, and to specifically folks, larger employers or folks involved in those kind of programs, have you encountered barriers to implementing that? So when we talk about commute trip reduction, we're talking about promoting ride sharing, carpooling, those kind of strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, active transportation, but also flexible schedules to allow people to work from home 1-2 days a week to just reduce emissions from those commutes. For those of you that may have been involved in those that are in this room, we're just curious to know, are you encountering barriers in those programs to implementing those, or are they working well and you'd like to sort of see those expanded?
We are public transport. Most of our staff are the drivers and the support staff. So it's kind of hard to make them work from home. Impossible to make them. In fact, they'd probably love to, but
doesn't work for every job. I hear that.
They did for a time during COVID. They got to work 3 days a week and we paid them for 40 hours. But yeah, so I think that the one thing that COVID taught us is that there isn't a remote option. So, and just encouraging folks to take advantage of that whenever possible. And when we do travel, in fact, it's in our travel policy. When we do travel for business, it's a requirement that we travel together to try to reduce, vehicle miles traveled and such.
Perfect. That's a good example. Has the city, I actually haven't asked John and Libby this, has the city have any formal program or explored this area? Like commute trip reduction, so a program or policy to support people just sort of.
So we are talking about ability to work from home a couple of days a week. There's been some questions of fairness because many people can't work from home because you can't sweep the street from home or mow a lawn from home. So there's discussion about where you can, how to do that. I think that generally speaking, the employees that are under 40, under 35 have a strong desire to work either more days and have days off or have the commute because they can go other places and get those jobs in this market. So I think that is a strong recruitment element for hiring people to have that ability. And I think that it's either that or what we do here, some people is they do a 980 shift. You do essentially every other Friday you get off because you've worked a matter of nines to get there. So those things seem very important in a bargaining chip and worker enticement to have those, if you can pull that off.
Perfect.
Was the question specific to city employees or
Yeah.
the city promoting vehicle miles VMT reduction throughout the city outside of the city employees?
The question specifically was just about whether the city had, as an employer, had implemented any commute trip reduction for employees. I want to keep us moving. Beth, is there anything else you want to touch on that slide?
No, but yeah, I just wanted that 980, and sometimes we see it as 410s, shift adjustments for the people that can't be working remotely. Yeah, so the next, yes, through EV adoption. So this, so it's regulated that the available cars to buy will become increasingly electric. But like I mentioned before, there's all these other sort of infrastructure things that need to happen to support that. And there are public fleets that also need to be turned over, made electrified. So public fleets to zero emission vehicles. This could also include things like hydrogen where applicable. Expand electric vehicle infrastructure in destinations and public buildings. So I heard there's an electric charger where you guys are right now. Malls, any kind of destination where people have to drive there and stay there. Ferry terminal. Require electric vehicle charging in new and retrofitted buildings. One place where this strategy can really have an impact is in EV charging in multifamily housing, especially existing multifamily housing, because people generally will charge at home. And it's not so hard if you've got a garage or a driveway to plug in at, but if you don't have those things, it can be a lot harder to charge at home. So facilitating EV charging in multifamily housing can allow multifamily housing residents to adopt EVs. So, yeah. So what are the general feelings about EV adoption and EV infrastructure in Anacortes?
I'll just make a quick go back to adding to the cost of housing by requiring, again, in Alaska, in my background, most every house, most every public building, most everywhere has outlets all over the place because it's really, really cold and we all plug in our block heaters to it. But that's just a standard 110 outlet. I'm pretty sure for electric vehicles, if you're requiring that in public infrastructure and new housing, that's quite more expensive for something that may or may not get used.
Some of these are also new state requirements, so not necessarily something that Anacortes would have to adopt locally per the new codes emerging that they are required to be EV ready. So some of that has been handled through other regulations. And I see you picked up your microphone.
So we have a fleet transition plan in our goal, in a zero emission plan actually. And we are planning on moving all of our vehicles to zero emissions. A couple of the issues that we're facing right now is, and again, we're building a new facility. We can't do it where we're at. We just don't have the capacity to grow it all, and we're on leased property. The county owns the property. We own the building. We have to give that back in the next couple of years. So we really can't do anything in our current facility, but moving to the new facility, that is a plan. But we already know that we have, and everybody in this building probably knows that we have, and online knows that we have constraints here. We don't have enough electricity to go around. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to power, all of these electric vehicles when PSE is telling us they can't give us the power to do that. So we only have two options, zero emissions options, and the other one is hydrogen. So we're really trying to get on board. There's some OSHA requirements that are required to be built into our shop so that we can even work on hydrogen buildings or vehicles rather. And then just the cost right now to do, if we can, so the one thing that's really important to note is, right, we have an all diesel 35 and 40-foot fleet. To purchase an electric or a hydrogen vehicle costs twice as much. So you go from, paying $650,000 or $680,000 for a diesel bus to, 1.2 up to 1.6, I think the hydrogen buses are. So it's very, a lot more expensive. We typically get grants for most of those. However, there's always a match associated and you have to come up with the match. So, if we were to go hydrogen right now, which looks like the way we might have to go to transition, to start trying to transition our bus fleet into hydrogen, it costs, if you do the equivalent per gallon, I think it's somewhere like $53 or $56 to a gallon, equivalent to diesel, where we're paying, maybe like $3 something a gallon, because they're having to truck it in from California. So we have all of these barriers, if you will, for us going zero emission, and it's a goal, but we have all of these challenges that we have to work through first.
Thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, I kind of wonder too. I'm just thinking about our bus fleet and our bus fleet mechanics, talk about bringing, new people in and stuff like that. Yeah, like mechanics are typically an aging group anyways, and most of them don't have that kind of training to just automatically flip over to electric or hydrogen or want to. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see what happens.
And, also there's the cart before the horse issue. You kind of touched on it. The electric grid, I don't know how it is in Skagit, but we look at it from the refinery, potentially electrifying different boilers and stuff like that. And it comes down to reliability. Right now, if we're on natural gas, we know that's pretty reliable. We can keep going. If we switch them and we're reliant on electricity and there's a blip in the system, everybody in this town knows when you have electric blip, it sets off compressors and you end up flaring, which is not what we want to do in any way. So all of these things are reliant on an electrical grid that first of all has the supply and second of all has the distribution in order to meet it. And I forget the statistics, but if even half of Skagit County went all electric with their vehicles, we'd probably bust the system pretty quick.
Yeah. In addition to that, I didn't think about this before, but it sounds like there's also a workforce factor there too. And I wonder, again, this is probably longer term, but if there's a chance to partner with Skagit Valley College in terms of, developing their education system to develop our local workforce in that area.
Partnerships, I think, with Debbie.
This is great.
Yeah.
Great feedback.
Super helpful. Yep.
And a really good example of the importance of this group, as well as just sort of the nuance as we develop goals and policies of, we're hearing, desire for more transit, want more service. We know that costs money. Also hearing goals for electrification, that's also going to have significant costs. And, just needing to sort of make sure we're not kind of creating policies that are challenging to implement, really looking for what those strategies. Information on your sheets, if you don't want to, I know we want to move through a few more slides, but ways that the city could help support that transition through partnerships or other ways is also helpful feedback for understanding how we can help support the electrification from regional partners and sort of help see that goal closer to implementation. If there are ways roles the city could play, that's also helpful feedback to understand. Beth, anything else you want to highlight here? Oh, sorry, did you want to?
No, except that, this really highlights the need both for efficiency measures, local generation, and for VMT reduction. Just to be able to make this transition, it's sort of like all hands on deck kind of an approach. You can't get there from just one measure on its own. Okay, next, can we talk about trees? Everybody loves trees. So here's this basic goal of increasing tree canopy cover to boost carbon sequestration, reduce heat islands, improve air quality, specifically targeting overburdened communities. And this also, so this is both talking about urban trees, to reduce heat island effects, make sure that, to reduce need for cooling, but also to make sure that, that your urban forest is maintained and, healthy, doesn't burn down, I think is the very biggest, sort of carbon goal there. Um, so, yeah, so measures to increase trees, preserve trees, maintain trees, make sure that your trees are going to be adaptable to the changing climate as well.
This is one we're also going to be picking up in the resilience sub-element. So we also kind of included it here to know it really does, just to highlight that it kind of plays both roles, that there's a lot of resilience value for in creating shade, helping in those areas where you may have denser development. You can utilize shade and trees planting to sort of help bring down that urban heat island effect that can be quite effective. So, so there's sort of, this is a really rich co-benefit, particularly in the context of Anacortes area. So that's another reason why I included it here in this greenhouse gas emissions conversation. I'm seeing thumbs up. Yeah, Marlene.
So I'm really glad to see the measures with the Department of Commerce that include urban forest management, the selection of trees, what types of trees, where they're planted and how they're managed. Because a lot of times there's studies about how urban areas, people plant trees, are required to plant trees when they take a tree out, and then the trees they plant die because they select the wrong trees or they're not properly maintained.
Great point.
Absolutely. And sometimes this action in particular includes updating your tree list with an eye towards what's going to thrive into the future.
Since we're going to be talking about this one again at the next meeting, I'm going to suggest we. Oh,
great.
Did I get ahead? Does Sandy have a comment?
I was just going to add that is connected to housing as well and building housing, because I know that a lot of times there'll be areas of forest that are just raised entirely. And if there's any way to have some measures to prevent that from happening so that at least some trees are left to be standing rather than having to raise the entire thing and then plant little tiny new ones, that would be an amazing measure coupled with the need to build new housing.
Perfect. Because I want to get you guys home before the bulk of the storm hits. And we just have a couple more, and these are kind of high level. So.
Sure. Yeah. So this next one, ferries and ports, there's a lot of boats. There's a lot of marine traffic going on. And it's harder to decarbonize than people's cars, although there are plans in place for the ferries. So these measures are really about collaborating with PSE. So this has been raised on the previous slides, but if the ferries are going to electrify, this is going to be a question of making sure that there's the right electrical infrastructure to make that happen. And then, so that's collaborate with regional and state partners, and then also collaborating with the marinas and the ports to support their electrification and the availability of their renewable fuels. So this is really a collaborative, like, bridge building, make sure PSE is at the table, make sure that we can do the things that we need to do kind of action.
Any questions there?
This only works sometimes. I just wanted to make a quick mention that the Port of Anacortes just received a very large electrification grant. So that's going on there. They're very proactive also in matters like this.
Great mention. Yeah, Kevin was on the meeting earlier, but had to duck out.
Yeah, so I'm very interested to hear how all these electrification of waterborne transit is going to interact with electricity supply in Anacortes, and what are the plans for that. So that is definitely an area of concern.
This is also a good example of an area of more challenging, where the reducing the emissions may be more challenging kind of in the immediate. There are clear directions on some of the others on how strategies are in place that other communities have adopted to sort of start drawing those down. This is an area where we're sort of seeing less sort of examples out there. So we'd love to hear from this group if we're missing things there, but also maybe an example of laying the groundwork through that coordination in this iteration of the climate element for kind of the next update so that you'll be able to sort of be ready to start thinking about programs. So that's kind of how we're thinking about this area of emissions, but really curious to see if that resonates or if we might be missing something here.
Can you, I'm sorry, I faded out there for a second. Can you say the beginning part one more time? I missed the question. I'm sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I know we're getting towards the end and we've been sitting a lot. So I think just to sort of summarize how we're thinking of this is an area where there are fewer sort of immediate things we can point to how to immediately bring these emissions down from waterborne travel. The ferry electrification has a strategy, so that's sort of in place, but at the state level and being implemented. But for more local emissions, it's more of a question mark. So our thinking is that this is more of, we want to include policies that really focus on the need for collaboration around this issue and partnering, working with the port, working with local businesses and industry to understand the challenges to help formulate a more long-term plan to address the source of emissions. That's kind of the thinking now that I'm getting a thumbs up in the room. Okay. Did I capture that well? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like this is sort of cutting edge right here. So this is an opportunity for Anacortes to lead, honestly. Yeah. Okay, so the very last one, waste. So this is both develop targeted campaigns for recycling material and also source reduction. So that means not making as much waste in the first place, which has implications for sort of way back the other side of those emissions, all of the consumption emissions. So source reduction, meaning less waste which can lead you to buy less stuff, is sort of the goal of this here. So it's both increased staff and faculty capacity for composting programs to divert waste from the landfill. And then sort of other potential measures to think about, materials recycling facilities in the city to recapture recyclables from the waste stream. And then also your wastewater treatment plant is in the process of implementing some upgrades. So this is another opportunity to think about how to manage greenhouse gases from the wastewater treatment plant.
This is really a facilities focused discussion. And I know Beth was following up also with staff on some of these questions, but we're really kind of looking for exploring how we can help reduce emissions from the waste from those areas. So not a huge source of emissions for the city, but there are some ways that this might happen. And so we're sort of exploring that. But any thoughts or background information in this area?
I think education is always the best way to go. Things change and it's hard for people to keep up even with the best of intentions. I actually work for a recycling company for my day job. And we, so this is, and I see this every day. We also, the city has not mandatory, but voluntary green bins for yard and food waste. And that goes to Skagit Soils, which is a licensed composting facility. I don't know that our zoning would allow, or we would want to change it to allow a composting facility in town. There's a lot to that. Same with an MRF. I think we have a pretty good system as it is. The city, we collect our own garbage and then we transload it to the Skagit transfer station. So I don't know if these are things we need to pursue, except for I know the wastewater treatment plant, we're waiting for regulations are changing and new requirements. And so that is definitely on the table of what we will do next, moving from an incineration plant. I think we're one of two in the state to something new, but we're not quite ready to do that because we don't have the guidance yet from ecology, et cetera.
Great background. We are right at 7, I think.
Mhm.
Losing my long distance vision. Beth, anything you want to lead?
No, I think, what I take away from this is that, electrification is a really, complicated issue in electricity supply, in Anacortes. And so, working with the utilities on that is going to be really important, along with lots of other stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. Just one slide to remind you. So December 4th, public meeting. Again, that's is the broader public meeting. This one is currently, and I think the plan is for online only. We'll be presenting remotely, marine waterfront focus. Again, you're encouraged to attend, particularly if that resonates with your area of interest, but this is not a climate team meeting. So don't feel obligated to attend if it don't work. This is sort of wanted you to be aware about the meeting. The January 14th will be our next climate team meeting. And we'll be focusing on kind of taking all the feedback you had from today on climate vulnerability, wrapping that work up, presenting that back to you, and then have a very similar conversation around resilience, around measures, but end of the day, more focused on resilience. So really, how do we help the city of Anacortes transition to become more resilient to the climate impacts, and where are the vulnerabilities that we're seeing that are most acute? We'll probably have an update on the goals and policies we talked about at this stage. That may also bleed into a February meeting. We're still kind of working out the schedule logistics there. So that's a little bit in flux, but definitely knowing that you're going to want to spend a little time with the goals and policies. So we're working to sort of get that into a format that's shareable, get that in front of staff so they have a chance to kind of review that first, and then we'll be getting that over to you. And then the tentative schedule right now, we're still kind of working out details, is going to Planning Commission in March, February, maybe March. So that's sort of still shifting around a little bit. So that is the compression of our timeline, and why we have to move a little bit quickly through this. And so we'll be doing our best to get you information ahead of meetings so you have a real chance to review. But that is the schedule that we have to meet in order to keep the overall effort on track. So we don't want to make Libby and John's job harder. So with that ends our official meeting, but any final questions or comments?
So the policies that, goals and policies that we'll be looking at, where are those coming from? Are those coming from Commerce and your group, or is this climate group throwing out anything with our local knowledge of Anacortes, like, hey, we considered this, and kind of talk it through?
The process that we've identified, so we're looking at commerce measures. We also may be sort of likely needing to translate those into how they relate to Anacortes, and the climate team or the consultant team will be leading that effort. We'll be working closely with staff. So the way we've sort of envisioned it is sharing that information and then using the climate team as an advisory to kind of review, help refine language, help refine approaches, and identify strategies. If you see specific policies or goals in the commerce measure tool, though, that are really key, or in action plans that you're seeing other communities do that you think would be very effective, that's incredibly helpful information. And we will certainly take that into account as we're working with staff and working amongst the climate team, or excuse me, the consultant team, to bring that forward. So that's very helpful. So feel free to send that. And Beth, anything you want to add to that? No, okay.
I wanted to just ask about that. Wouldn't it be good if we make suggestions on additional measures in our team rather than send individual comments to you?
Yeah.
Could we have time on an agenda to add or talk about other measures that we saw that might be good?
Yeah, or what I could also do, did folks have access to, when I sent out the guiding principle? I know one person had access to that, but it was kind of a shared on SharePoint. We could set up a similar kind of template as just sort of because it's late in the day, I'm just gonna say dumping ground. It's not a very good, not a very good term, but just a document that can kind of capture a lot of the thinking in those areas. Would that be helpful? I'm seeing a few head shake. And that would be a way for you guys to just sort of put that in a central location, and then we can kind of see and pick from that and review. That sounds great. So we will, I'll put that on my to-do list.
And then ultimately this climate element of our growth plan goes before the planning committee and they vote on what they want to put in there.
All proposed amendment, well, the new climate element and any proposed amendments to the rest of the comprehensive plan go to the planning commission for public hearings. And so what you review and propose and discuss will be put into the document and then brought to the planning commission for public hearings. The planning commission then, based on what, they see will and hear from the public, will make a recommendation to the city council for whether to adopt it that way or to make any changes. And then the city council makes the decision.
Okay.
We're 5 minutes over and I don't want to get a reputation for holding you late. So I'm going to say done, but please follow up if you have questions. You have my email for sure. So, and thank you so much for coming out on a blustery night. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.